introduce to you the first speaker, Mr. Michel Chossudovsky. Our first speaker wears many hats. He is an economist from the University of Ottawa who has published several books relating to poverty, globalization, and the role of international monetary institutions such as the World Bank and IMF. An esteemed writer, his works have been translated into more than 20 languages. His other hats include that of an advisor to numerous governments and also consultant to international organizations such as the UNDP. Ladies and gentlemen, he is Professor Michel Chossudovsky.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to be here today as an economist in a country which is committed to national sovereignty in the economic sense of the word, and at a very critical moment in the history of this country, namely 1997, under the helm of Dr. Mahathir, precise and specific mechanisms, financial mechanisms were put in place which allowed, or at least prevented, the slide of the ringgit and foreclosed the possibility of massive bankruptcy and impoverishment as occurred in Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea. I say this is not a rhetorical question, because war and economic and macroeconomics are intimately related. These free market reforms have been essentially an instrument of dramatic impoverishment of millions of people around the world, and the fact that Malaysia was able, under very difficult conditions, to foreclose this, I think it will be a landmark, certainly in the nation's history for years to come. Today, the world is at the crossroads of the most serious crisis in modern history. The United States has launched, together with its indefectible ally, Great Britain, a military adventure which threatens the future of humanity. It is also coupled, as I mentioned, by these deadly macroeconomic reforms. The war has an economic rationale to it. It is not, it certainly is not, it does not have the objective of weeding out terrorism. It has underlying economic objectives, the most important of which, as far as the Middle East war is concerned, is securing control over oil reserves. It is characterized by advanced weapons systems. This morning, Helen Caldicott focused on the issue of nuclear weapons. There's the whole doctrine of preemptive nuclear war, which is, of course, crucial. But one thing which I think is very important to understand is how the concepts have been turned upside down. as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, the United States has developed a new generation of what we call tactical nuclear weapons. They're mini nukes, small nuclear weapons, but in fact they're not so small. They are between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb. And what has happened is that these nuclear weapons now, after a period of review, are considered, quote unquote, safe for civilians. Okay? Safe for civilians. Bear in mind, it's a little bit like the advisory on a cigarette, which says smoking is dangerous for your health. Now, what has happened, very important, is that the Pentagon has enlisted scientists and research labs, and they said, well, essentially these explosions are underground and they are safe for civilians. And in 2003 December decision, the Senate ultimately approved the use of tactical nuclear weapons in conventional war theaters. This decision has not been reported extensively or even in a minimal way in the international press. But what this means today is, in addition to the debate that we had this morning on nuclear weapons, that this new generation of nuclear weapons now has been reclassified as a conventional weapon which can be used in conventional war theaters. That is precisely the nature of that Senate decision. And it is also slated to be used in the next phase of this war. Coupled with the military agenda, which is a war without borders, we see the emergence within the Western European countries, particularly the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia. We see the emergence of a police state apparatus. We see the criminalization, what I would describe as the criminalization of justice, because ultimately those who decide on the judicial system are the war criminals. And we have a whole pattern and structure of arbitrary arrests of individuals who are tagged or targeted for alleged terrorist activity. Ladies and gentlemen, the war on terrorism, which is the main justification for waging a war of conquest, which is clearly acknowledged in military and national security documents, that war on terrorism is fabricated. It fabricates an enemy. The enemy is presented. There's the image of the enemy, bin Laden. In fact, the whole issue becomes so absurd. If you read some of the speeches and the national security documents, Osama bin Laden is presented as a nuclear power. Okay? Al-Qaeda is presented as capable of setting off nuclear explosions, so that it is an upcoming nuclear power, and therefore this justifies the development of preemptive nuclear weapons for defensive purposes and so on, and the use of these tactical nuclear weapons again in conventional war theaters. This is the map of the area. As you see, it is totally militarized. It's a region which encompasses some 70% of global oil and gas reserves, at least according to the estimates. Now, 70% of global oil and gas reserves is something about 30 times those of the United States of America. So we can understand the economic and strategic nature of this region. We see, of course, Saudi Arabia, the country with the largest reserves, followed by Iraq with 11% of total oil and gas reserves. Iran is number 3. And essentially this war is a war of conquest of oil reserves. It's not the sole purpose of this war, but it is certainly one of the key objectives, is to secure control and confiscate, of course, the resources and assets of the countries under attack. Iran is the next phase of this war. This is not a rhetorical question. It has been confirmed in military documents and press reports. In this particular case, and it's also an important landmark, Israel is slated to play a direct role in the bombing campaign, so that we are evolving from an Anglo-American military axis, which is based on the integration of American and British interests in the oil industry as well as in the military-industrial complex, to the participation of Israel directly in a military operation directed against Iran. The preparations for this campaign have already been completed. I should mention that this involves also the participation of Turkey. There have been joint military exercises which occurred earlier this year, and there has been a large stockpiling of both conventional as well as nuclear weapons in preparation for a possible bombing. I'm not suggesting that the bombing will necessarily take place or when it will take place, but it is part of the process of military planning, and at this stage the military alliance is in a state of readiness, and Israel is slated to play the major role in this military operation. Now, if you look at the region and you have an understanding of the geopolitics, you'll realize immediately that if Israel becomes officially part of the military axis, it's unofficial up to now, immediately what's going to happen is that the war is going to spread to the entire Middle Eastern region. Okay? We have here distinct war theaters, essentially Afghanistan, Iraq, and Palestine. But as soon as this conflict extends into Iran and Syria, the entire Middle Eastern region will flare up, and we should not exclude, as Helen Caldicott warned this morning, that the military alliance will not use nuclear weapons. Why? Because in the logic of military planning, these nuclear weapons have already been reclassified. And that means that a 3-star general could decide, reading the military manual, that these are safe for civilians and go ahead and use them. And he doesn't need any permission to do it. They're stockpiled, they're there, and they are safe for civilians. So if they're safe for civilians, I'm going to use them. And that is precisely the danger which underlies, of course, this entire propaganda campaign. Now, I just have one, I hope I get through this in the next 2 minutes, but I think we should understand that the United States is involved in a war, in a global military project. This is a quote from a document which is called The Project for the New American Century. It was released in September 2000, and it identifies very clearly the ultimate objectives of U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. Bear with me. Defend the American homeland, of course, against whom? Against terrorists. In fact, it's a pretext to establish the Homeland Security State and derogate civil rights across the land. But this particular objective, which is so clear, it says, fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars. That means that the United States is, from its own statements, involved in a war of global conquest, ultimately targeting Russia and China through these theater wars, as well as what they call constabulary functions, which are the functions of surveillance and control through selective bombing, the sending in of special forces, and so on and so forth. The last objective of the PNAC is essentially the revolution in military affairs, which is a massive development of new weapon systems, nuclear weapons, militarization of space, and so on. So that this is the project, and we are told that the war has a humanitarian mandate, that the war is to weed out terrorists, and I can tell you from extensive research, I obviously do not have the time, that first of all, Al-Qaeda is a creation of the US intelligence apparatus. It's extremely well documented. Many of the terrorist attacks are, in fact, orchestrated by the US intelligence and military. We can go into the details this afternoon, and there's a lot of corroborating evidence. And in conclusion, my recommendation is regime change in the United States of America. Regime change in the United Kingdom. And if we believe in the international system, we have a long history of imposing sanctions. We imposed sanctions on South Africa. Let us debate the issue of imposing economic and political sanctions on the United States of America. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.